Hi all, I'm Jeanette Keynes from Jewelry Arts Inc. And in this video, I'm going to show you how to lay out and start soldering an ancient style ring, the bezel ring. So just to show off, look at all these beautiful bezels. So these are cabochon sapphires, and Amanda made these lovely bezels. So basically what we did is we went through, we made sure that every bezel fit every stone nicely with no extra gaps. We sanded them top and bottom, and they're all down now to about 2.5 millimeters, because this is going to be a bezel ring that goes all the way around your finger. And when you're making one of those rings, they're already a little bit bulky. So if your bezels are real high, you could literally maybe not be able to close your hand, which you don't want that. So we usually find around 2.5 millimeters to be, a good height. And I don't want to do all that filing and sanding after they're attached. It's much easier when they're separate. So we're now at the stage that okay, everything's the right size, the right height, everything's sanded, everything's looking groovy. So our next mission is the back sheet. So the way that these rings are made is super weird. It's an ancient style of ring. It's not made like a normal ring, because what we're going to do is we're going to solder one bezel down to a long strip of back sheet, and then we're going to saw to score, and we'll bend. And then we solder another bezel on, and we saw and we bend, and that's basically how the ring achieves ring shape. I mean, it'll make a lot more sense when I actually start doing it instead of just doing this in case this is not like super explicit. We're gonna take our dividers and we're gonna measure a strip for our back sheet. I would say about 2 or 3 millimeters wider than your widest stone. We're gonna draw a line straight down the middle, but you don't wanna cut it so narrow that like if you breathe on a bezel and it moves a tiny bit, it's gonna like fall off the edge. So I usually look and see like, where's my biggest stone? I mean, these are all extremely similar in size, but I'm gonna go like, okay, that's my biggest one. And take my dividers. You see what I mean? Like, give myself a little room on either side. Okay? So what that means is we're gonna cut a nice long strip, like that, of silver. Now we can use fine silver or sterling silver. I usually do it probably around, could be 22 gauge. It could be 20 gauge if you want, but honestly for this ring, this bezel ring, what gives it its strength is not the thickness of the back sheet, it's the solder connections between each bezel. And again, that'll make a lot more sense later when I actually show it to you. So we're gonna go cut our strip and put a line down the middle, and then we'll reconvene. Okay, so here's the back sheet that we cut, a little bit wider than the widest stone. And then what we did is we scribed a center line down the middle. It's essential when you're doing something like this and you want it to actually stay straight in a row, that you have that center line to work off of. Like, you think you'll be able to line it up, you will not. It's no aspersion on any of you out there. It's just that it's one of those things. If you don't have a line to follow, you can forget it. So what we're gonna do is up on the tripod, we're gonna solder down our first bezel, just, normal, but I'll show you how to do that. And then after that is when we start to do this sort of fancy sawing and bending. I mean, soldering is the most fun, so, in my opinion.
It can be.
Susie's just looking at me like,
she's like, I'm not so sure about that.
I'm not sure.
Very scary to me.
It is, but you will get past that into the love phase. Or the pyromaniacal phase, which is where I am. So we're gonna use, this is all fine silver, so we're gonna start with the IT solder. And as per always, I'm just gonna like cut a fringe and just cut a bunch of them, and we'll ball them up so that they're here. Nothing makes me more crazy than when I'm in the middle of soldering, like, having one solder ball or something like that, and then it inevitably, of course, rolls across the bench. You lose it, and yeah. Maybe that only happens to me, but I don't think so. I think that's a common humanity experience. I think a couple of these might be a little extra big. I'll cut that in half. I like to be prepared with extra solder, because you're just going to be doing this one after the other. We're going to like solder and saw and bend, and then solder and saw and bend, and you know. Okay. And you know, when we ball up solder, hot and fast, same with soldering, you just get right in there, like so. Because if you go slowly, they'll turn out like beef jerky, you know what I mean? They get kind of like shrivelly and dried up looking, and that's not good. Yes. Okay. So if that ever happens and you heat it too slow and it looks like beef jerky, just get rid of them and on to some next, because sometimes they won't reflow well or even at all if that happens. You know, if they just get really like, and they literally do look like there's like they're dehydrated, you know. It's not good. They don't look happy, put it that way. Now, are we lining these up in a particular way? Like, in other words, do you want it this way? Do you want them like a little...
So, yeah, that was a question, because the original design of the ring was, it was alternating colors, and since I couldn't find a complementary other stone, so...
Okay.
I'm open to what you think would be interesting.
Well, sizing wise, it's best to have the stone as narrow as possible, because when you get to the end of this ring, you get to a point where you either add another stone or you don't.
Right.
And that's actually a relatively big increment, which is why these rings, I'm not going to lie to you, are a little tricky to size. I mean, we size them, but it's not exactly a very tight science, shall we say. So I'm going to say, because of that,
so like
let's go this way. Yeah. If they were smaller, I'd say, oh, you know, maybe we could, because sometimes it's fun to do kind of a more random ish looking pattern. But I think for this, I think that'll be better. Okay. So I'm going to take a ball or two of solder. I added a little hot water to my paste flux so it's nice and soupy. I'm just going to pop it in there. As long as the solder is up against the edge of the bezel, it doesn't really matter where it is.
So you're doing one on either side.
Yep. Okay. But when I go to dry this, if they roll together, I don't care. You know what I mean? Like, as long as they're up against the bezel, that is what is important. Because if they're good and hot, the seam is just going to suck them right in. And so in other words, if they're not evenly spaced, it doesn't matter. It'll flow around anyway.
Okay. So and 2.
2 is just, when I look at the balls of solder I have, that looks around right to me. You know what I mean? If your balls were smaller, maybe I'd put in 4. But after you do your first one, you'll be able to get a pretty good sense of like, was that too much? Is that too little? And adjust accordingly. I've just have done a buttload of these, so I'm like, yeah, that looks good. And I'm lining it up on that center line. And of course, knowing that when I go to dry this, it'll probably move like a jerk, but you know. This is life as a metalsmith, you know. So I'm just going to dry the flux a little bit, and then I'm going to put it up here, and we'll solder up here, up on the tripod. So you see what I mean? How those little stinkers like to wiggle around, you know what I mean? I like I said, as long as they end up against the edge, I don't care. The only thing I am going to do is stand up so that I can look at this and make sure that my bezel is nicely lined up over that center line. Okay, I'm going to pause for a second and let Alexis get over top of it and just take a quick shot of that so you can see. But you see what I mean? As long as the balls are up against the edge of the bezel, it's really all we care about.
They're together.
It doesn't matter.
Drying looks like...
Yeah, I just dried it because...
So you almost don't see any of the flux anymore.
Yeah, because here's the thing. When you heat that, the flux starts to bubble up, the solder starts to hop around, and I figured I'd probably need to poke it back in place anyway. I could have done that up here, but sometimes it's a little easier to just be down here and look at it. Okay? I'm going to pick it up on the tripod. Whenever you're working with a screen and a tripod, the only thing you want to remember is never set up your piece so that you're right underneath this edge, because then you try to heat there and you can't get it hot. So just make sure it's somewhere in the middle.
And doesn't matter if the meshes.
No, everybody worries about the hole, but the fact is actually most of the time the hole helps you because it lets more heat get through. So usually you just position it around.
So you just ignore it, just you don't want to be on it, and then just keep it away from it. Okay.
Yeah. So I've got a big tip on here. You could probably go a little smaller if you wanted to, but in general, you know, with soldering, hot and fast is what it's all about. If you're on the fence, go bigger. You want to get in there, get it hot, and bugger off, like, you know what I mean? So you have to, when you're soldering, the really important thing is you have to be really present. In the sense that when you're soldering, I don't care what happens in this joint. You know what I mean? Like, I don't care if the doorbell rings or, like, I don't know, the lights flicker on and off, whatever happens. Your focus has to be right there on that solder, so that as soon as the solder flows, you can get the hell out. You know what I mean? You just have to just really be there. Be there with your solder. Okay, nice big tip. Position it directly underneath my bezel. And you notice I don't waste time wiggling around. Right underneath there, man. And then watch what's gonna happen. See that? And it starts to flow. And my back sheet is a little wonky, so I'm probably gonna press on the bezel just a little bit. Because it's not so easy, honestly, to get these, whoop, there you go, there you go, there you go, okay?
So it's still not, so you could still kind of see a little, but that's gone. I mean, just a little bit.
Don't
of
touch it.
Okay, well.
No. I mean, you can point, but I'm just, sometimes it can be easy to get, you know what I mean? Yes, there's a little scar where the solder balls were, but that doesn't matter. Because I don't care about that. All I was looking to do. Now, I should have double checked to make sure that this was really flat, and I didn't. So instead, I had to kind of press on it while I was soldering, which is naughty. Normally, you would want to make sure first that they're really flat and laying there and behaving themselves before we solder. So,
What's the laying flat? The back sheet?
so that, yes, because there was a little space between the bezel and the back sheet on one end. I just pressed it down. It's fine. I'm just saying, normally, so that I don't model bad behavior, you should check that beforehand instead of getting in there and poking it and fixing it during. It's a little bit of, like, you know, do what I say and not what I do, in other words, at that moment.
If you can flatten it now.
Oh, it's done. I just pressed it down. It's touched.
As your...
Yeah, exactly. I just did it. As I explained before, I naughtily went ahead and soldered, even though the back sheet wasn't so perfectly flat. So after we pickled, we can see that the one end is not totally filled in. So I just pressed the bezel down a little bit, and we're going to put another piece of solder in.
Smell?
I don't know. Probably, because she drops it and runs, man.
Yeah.
She is fast. And I wanted to make sure to show it because, you know, we don't want to just show the highlight reel. We want to show the real jewelry making, man, where you're like, oh, oops. Yeah, but it's no big deal. We literally just add one more piece of solder. So I'm gonna dip a ball in the paste books and stick it in there. Okay. And then I'm going to dry it, hopefully gently, and just as long as the ball of solder ends up against the wall of the bezel, that's all we care about. It's getting a little shiny. I have to even go to the bigger tip. Oh yeah, there it goes. You see that? So that we made this a thick back sheet, and it's really this long piece. So that's why it's taking longer than you would sort of expect. You know what I mean? Even though you're just soldering down a little bezel, because we got to get this whole thing hot. But it's all good. So it flowed, it filled in. I'm gonna let you get over top of it so you can get a close up of that. But then basically we'll throw it in the pickle, come back, and then we'll do the sawing and bending. Okay?
It's great.
Oh, and by the way, The reason that we do this from underneath is that solder tends to follow the most heat, right? So if you heat from the top, like the solder kind of wants to run up the bezel rather than filling in the seam. So a lot of things when we're soldering a bezel to a back sheet type thing, we do it up on the tripod so we can heat from underneath. So even though I'm not the biggest fan of the bench pin because they poke me in the boobs and I hate that, for certain things it's kind of a necessity, and this is one of them. So I'm going to put it in. Because the way that this ring is made is super weird. We solder a bezel down flat, and then we're going to score it and bend. And we're going to bend it at like the appropriate angle for the size ring that we want. So we have the bezel mandrel, the ring mandrel here with the sizes on it. And like after we bend it, we're going to hold it up against it, and I'll show you. I'll show you how to do that. But so first, I have a 6-0 blade, which is nice and thin, and I'm going to just scooch over here just a little bit to use the boob poker. Because what I want to do is I want to score a line right next to this bezel so that I can make a nice sharp bend there. Okay? So in order to do that, I need to saw. I'm not going to saw all the way through the back sheet, but enough to score it, enough to get like a nice little nick there so that I can bend it. And what you want is that bend to be right next to the bezel. So in order to ensure that it's right next to the bezel, I take my saw blade and I run it down the bezel. You know what I mean? In contact, so that you're not leaving a gap in between. In other words, okay? And I'm going to answer the question that everyone is thinking. No one has ever sawed all the way through their ring.
Yet.
She said, confidently. Okay, so I'm going to let you come in. I want you guys to look at it, and I want you to try to get a close shot of it. Because what it is, you can just see from the side, there's just a little nick. You know what I mean? And that tells us there's enough of a score mark there that we'll be able to bend it. Okay? So look at it from the side, and then let Alexis get in there so that hopefully we can show what that looks like.
I wish I could see like that.
I know, right? So there it is. There's the neck in extreme close-up. So obviously you don't want it to go all the way through, but if you don't see that little nick there, it's not enough. You know what I mean? You won't be able to get a sharp bend. Okay? Alexis just made an excellent point, which is, yes, make sure you see a nick on both sides, because you don't always saw evenly, and you need to make that bend. Okay, so now we're going to take our chain nose pliers, and we're going to grab it like so, and I'm going to take my thumb, and I'm going to, you don't have to make the dumb sound effect if you don't want, but it helps me. And there's my bend. Now I'm guesstimating. I'm now going to hold it up against the mandrel and see if that's too sharp or too shallow. You said 7.5?
Yes.
Yeah, I've done a couple of these before. So
Perfect.
you see that? Because you're kind of visualizing the bend when you look straight down from the top, that if you continue with that kind of bend, it'll go all the way around that. So here, like take a look. You see what I'm saying?
Mm-hmm. So you've got the angle.
Yeah, that's a good angle for 7.5. So now we're going to solder the next one down, because after each one, we're going to saw and bend after we solder down each bezel. So let's solder our next bezel down. Now, one thing I want to point out, because there will be a temptation at some point in this process to be taking this and kind of bending it on the mandrel. You can't do that because it'll distort your bezels. You have to bend it using your pliers and then just compare it to the mandrel. Do you know what I'm saying? The urge will come. The dark moment will come, and you'll be like, I want to just hear my voice in your head saying, don't do that. Because what happens is, since the bezels are thinner than the back sheet, when you do that, it's the bezels that'll actually distort, and then they won't fit your stone anymore, blah, 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 all bad things. So don't do that. Okay? So
how do you get the next?
I'm just gonna press that area a little bit, like with my pliers, so that hopefully it's nice and flat right there. And this is when you see the hole becomes your friend. Because look. Yeah, see, everyone's like, oh no, the hole. And I'm like, oh no, the hole is your friend. Don't be afraid of the hole.
Interesting.
It sounds really weird and gross now, but yep.
So you're not, but how do you make sure it's flat so you avoid what happened before?
Well, that's what I did with my pliers, is I gave it a little squish so that hopefully it's nice and flat. But
Okay.
now when I put the bezel on there, we're going to check, unlike what I did before, we're going to actually confirm that they, yes, rather than just
Fire
wildly, go right ahead. Because now it is indeed lovely and flat. Now another thing, you want these bezels as close together as they really can be.
Interesting. Okay.
So if you notice, the bases of the bezels are pretty much touching, and I'll let Alexis get in there a little close from the side and the
So
top.
you're really
whatever.
hugging the line.
Yeah, yes,
right
exactly.
again, okay.
Because eventually we're going to be filling solder in between those bezels, and that's going to be what really creates the structural strength for this. So it's important that the spaces be small. The bigger the spaces are, it'll still work, of course. It'll take a lot more effort to get it filled in with solder and blah 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 blah. But yeah, we want those bases essentially touching each other.